Okay, I think we've got a full house, so we can slowly begin. Hello and welcome, everybody. I'm going to keep it very brief. We have the honor of having Professor Erik Zürcher with us today, as you're all here for. And this is an event that we are organizing at IPC together with the Foundation's Development Directorate of Sabancı University, from which Professor Emre Erol is with us today, and I would like to thank him as well for bringing this event to IPC, as well as, of course, to the university. So thank you very much, Emre Hocam. And today, Professor Zürcher will talk to us about the poison of nostalgia from a historical perspective. Now, of course, this is an an interdisciplinary matter, I think, as I'm an international relations scholar, as an IR scholar. We've been working on this as well, the chronopolitics of foreign policy, especially in today's populist authoritarian discourse. But of course, a historian's view is extremely valuable also in informing scholars from IR like myself, but also from other disciplines who are thinking these days about how history matters in contemporary politics, especially in the populist playbook. Globally, not just in Turkey, but in various places. You have it in Hungary, you have it in Russia, you have it in the United States, so it's a global phenomena. And before we move to the talk, let me also, although he does not need an introduction, especially for this audience, let me still give a very brief introduction of Professor Zürcher. He's a Professor Emeritus of Turkish Studies at Leiden University, former academic director of the Leiden University Institute of Area Studies and of the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam. He's also a member of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has published 14 books and some 200 articles on late Ottoman and Turkish Republican history. Most have been translated into Turkish. Zürcher's main research interest has been the continuity between the Second Constitutional Period and the early Republic. And of course, he's a name that we have grown up with at university. When I was an undergraduate, he was among the first that I read. So it was a core curriculum at Boğaziçi University where I was a student. And so it is such an honor and privilege for me today to introduce him on this platform. So, Professor Zürcher, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and of course, a big thank you to Sabancı University and the IPC for hosting me. It's a great pleasure to be here, to be in Istanbul, to be in this building, and a special thanks also, of course, to Emre Erol, former student and longtime friend and colleague now, who took the initiative for this visit and thereby also for this lecture. So, you've seen the topic of today. So my lecture tonight will look at the way nostalgia for empire has played a role in the political history of two countries on the outer edges of Europe, Turkey and the United Kingdom, which each have had an intense but problematic relationship with the European Union for a very long time. I will try to argue that the political manipulation and fabrication of nostalgia has had very detrimental effects on this relationship. Before we start, however, I think I have two confessions to make. The first is this. This lecture, in a way, is an exercise in thinking out loud about three entities: the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Turkey. And I can, of course, claim expertise only on one of the three. On the others, I'm just a newspaper reader. The second confession is this. This is, as the title says, a historian's view. In other words, I will approach the problem from a professional historian's perspective, but it is also personal. Born in 1953, I have experience of the process of European integration throughout my life. When I went on holidays to the south of France, in the back seat of my parents' car, I was both excited and scared when we had to pass the Belgian and then the French customs with their unfamiliar and threatening uniforms. My father used to carry a set of envelopes in his jacket, each with a different currency, bought weeks in advance at our local bank. Travel insurance was a big thing because breaking a leg in a foreign country meant that, you had to be covered and you could not simply use your health insurance from home. And now we drive to Paris without even carrying a passport, use our phones to pay in euros everywhere, and we're covered wherever we go. So Europe has become a tangible reality in my lifetime. Also, as a Dutchman, I come from what is perhaps the most Anglophile country in Europe, where educated people always prided themselves on being close to Britain, affected British ways, and they also prided themselves on being seen as such by the British themselves. I was no exception. Both privately and professionally, I stayed in Britain countless times and felt a strong affinity with the country. Imagine the shock for me and for that whole group of middle-class Dutchmen when in 2016 the people of Great Britain decided they did not want to be part of Europe. Brexit was truly traumatic, not just in Britain, for us too, because it felt not just like a separation, but as a rejection. The apparent closeness between Dutch, maybe Belgian, on the one hand, and British turned out to be an illusion. That feeling was actually very similar to that experienced now in the Trumpian moment by hardcore Atlanticists. Finally, from 1971 onwards, first as a student, then as a university teacher and researcher, I have focused on Turkey for over 50 years. In the early 2000s, I was involved in giving expert opinions on Turkey's accession to the European Union. I was convinced that the accession would be of great benefit both to Turkey and to Europe. So I was very disappointed when, from 2010 onwards, the process came to a halt for various reasons, among them the descent into authoritarianism in Turkey itself. In different ways, therefore, it is not just a historian's view. All three elements, Europe, Britain, Turkey, have played a large part in my life. So that makes these reflections part of a personal story as well as a historical one. Now, Europe, as it took shape since World War II, in the form of first the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, then the European Economic Community in 1957, later the European Community, still later in 1993, the European Union, that was fundamentally a political project which aimed to prevent a repeat of the wars on the continent through economic integration. So the goal was political, the means were economic. This cannot be overstated. It's really important. The motivating force behind it for the first two generations of European politicians, the ones that actively took part in World War II and the ones that experienced World War II as children, defeat, occupation, and devastation brought about by the war were the dominant motivation. For some of the founding countries, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, that defeat came early in 1940. followed by Nazi occupation. For some, Italy and Germany, it came late, 1943 to 1945, followed by Allied occupation, and in the case of Italy, both Nazi and Allied occupation. The devastation of total war was experienced by all. After 1990, when first the communist regimes in Central and Eastern Europe collapsed, and later the Soviet Union itself, the European project took on a new dimension with its eastward enlargement. The countries that now joined, countries like Poland, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, etc., had all shared the experience of defeat, occupation, and devastation in World War II, but for them it had been followed by nearly half a century of Communist Party oppression coupled with Soviet occupation. This means that in the 90s, for these countries, the countries now joining the EU, also it was primarily a political project. Just as much, in fact, as it had been for the original founding members. Sure, and there was a desire for better living standards, for free travel, for better life, for personal freedom, all of that. But anchoring the newly liberated countries in the Western Bloc as an insurance against a possibly resurgent Soviet Union or Russia was a key motive. So, political aims, economic tools. Between the initial phase and the enlargement after the Cold War, the European unification project proved successful and attractive enough for other European countries to want to join. So here we come to the UK and Turkey. Throughout its history, the European Union, and I'll use this term incidentally, although of course it's anachronistic. Before 1993 there was no European Union. But the European Union always had three close neighbors, which each had a history as an independent imperial power, and which had to position themselves towards the emergence of this gradually unifying Europe. They were Britain, Russia, and Turkey. During the Cold War era, until 1990, that positioning was largely determined by that very Cold War. Britain sought membership of the EU, but the French President de Gaulle twice vetoed its accession in 1963 and 1967. At the third time of asking, though, in 1972, Britain became a member, a decision confirmed by a referendum in Britain in 1975. Turkey asked for and received associate membership in 1963, precisely because of its role in the Cold War as a key member of the Western Alliance. A customs union was concluded in 1995, and the status of candidate member was finally achieved in 1999. Membership negotiations were started in 2005. Russia is a very different case, of course. The Soviet Union saw the EU as a client of the United States of America, and therefore a manifestation of its enemy, and it never attempted close cooperation. Instead, it developed the Comecon Pact, originally from 1949, as an alternative to the EU in Eastern Europe. After the end of the Cold War, beginning in the 90s, all of this changed, and the three countries had to position themselves towards the EU anew. Now, in this lecture, I will not look at the case of Russia. We could have done that, but I haven't, for several reasons. There can be no doubt at all that under Vladimir Putin, both the nostalgia for the pre-1917 Tsarist Empire and for the Soviet Union as a world power have been very actively stimulated by the leadership and used to mobilize support for an aggressive foreign policy that has culminated in the attack on Ukraine. And in that process, the two have become conflated. The restoration of the geographical scope and superpower status of the Soviet Union, but as a Russian state whose identity is defined on the basis of historical, cultural, and religious elements. So nostalgia of empire has been very much in evidence in Russia in the last 20 years. Yet, a full discussion of the Russian case, I feel, is not all that relevant for a discussion of the question that is sort of in the background of my lecture today, and that is, to what extent has the nostalgia for empire contributed to the estrangement between the European Union, on the one hand, and its most important neighbors on the other. It's not relevant, firstly, because the option of Russia becoming a member of the European Union has never been seriously considered, and secondly, because Russia is not only a nation of empire, to quote Michael Meeker in his famous book on Turkey, in the sense that Turkey is a nation coming from empire, or the UK, where the same could be said, Russia actually still is an empire. Moscow rules over 21 national republics and 3 autonomous regions, all 24 of which are defined as national units with a separate peoples with their own separate languages and cultures. That is an empire. I will therefore limit myself to taking a comparative look at the cases of the United Kingdom on the one hand and Turkey on the other, 2 countries with a legacy of empire. 2 countries also that have shown an interest in joining the EU from quite early on, but also, I think this is quite important by the way, 2 countries that did not share the original impetus, the experience of totalitarianism, occupation, destruction of total war that motivated the founder members of the EU as well as the countries that joined from the former Soviet bloc. For the United Kingdom and Turkey, accession to the EU was always more of a calculated and transactional decision, and in that sense, perhaps, they resemble countries like Denmark and Sweden more than the core countries. So that made the relationship between the European countries and the UK and Turkey more vulnerable to begin with, because they lacked this underlying motivation. Now, for the question of the role of nostalgia for empire, let's first look at the United Kingdom and its dramatic break with the European Union, which we call Brexit. As mentioned, Britain had finally, after a decade of failed attempts, become an EU member, a choice confirmed by a referendum in Britain in 1975. There was, however, always a sizable opposition to membership within the UK. The whole reason Prime Minister Harold Wilson had to organize a referendum in 1975 on the question was that the majority of his own Labour Party opposed membership. So a sort of reversal there in the 1960s and 70s. The left in the UK was against EU membership, where later the right was. So he organized a referendum, much like David Cameron was to do 40 years later. The opposition never went away, and never went away entirely, but by the 2000s it became much more vocal, both within the main parties, Labour and the Conservatives, and also through the emergence of UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, a party formed specifically to get Britain out. as you will remember, a party that ironically was not represented in the Westminster Parliament, but was represented in Brussels, in the European Parliament. In the elections of 2015, the Conservative leader, David Cameron, therefore, promised a referendum on the issue, and the result, of course, was the highly unexpected vote to leave the EU in 2016. Now, during the Brexit campaign in 2016, and also in the years that followed, there were frequent journalistic references to a nostalgia for empire. In the media, all kinds of media, both in Britain and abroad. And the suggestion was that a nostalgia for empire had been an important factor that had motivated Leave voters. Now, this argument was very often presented in a very simplistic manner and without any convincing proof. But it did appeal, and it did therefore trigger a research line that over the past few years has yielded some excellent academic work done on this question. And my analysis is based primarily on three of them. Robert Sanders' 2020 article, Brexit and Empire, Global Britain and the Myth of Imperial Nostalgia. Peter Mitchell's 2021 book, Imperial Nostalgia, or How the British Conquered Themselves. And Francesca Millich's 2020 article, Euroscepticism, Anti-Nostalgic Nostalgia, and the Past Perfect Post-Brexit Future, if you can still sort of mentally process that. What they teach us is that the link between nostalgia for empire and the Leave vote for Brexit has indeed been oversimplified in the media and in academia. It did play an important role, but in a more subtle way than often presented. To begin with, nostalgia for empire was not a new phenomenon. It was not an invention of the early 21st century in Britain. It is part of the history of empire itself. That is something that is very clearly demonstrated by these researchers. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, and when the expansion of the British Empire was at its height, the early conquests and voyages of the 16th and 17th century by people like Drake were instrumentalized. They were used to create support in society for the imperial venture, for the extension of the British Empire over the world. So already in the 1880s, 1890s, you see that kind of nostalgia for empire being used. Those early empire builders and precursors were glorified. And in that discourse, which is also visible in the 1930s, the empire is seen as the reward gained by plucky small nation of adventurers and entrepreneurs that conquered the world and so became a dominant power. So the empire is not the origin of greatness, it is proof of the greatness of the British nation. There's an important difference there. Now, after World War II, this discourse came back as something taken up by the right wing of the Conservative Party, most prominently in the 1960s by conservative politician Enoch Powell, who very much promoted this idea that the empire was the proof of the essential capabilities of the British nation, which should not be diluted by immigration. And some of it was also taken up by Margaret Thatcher in the late 70s and 80s. Thatcher, who of course also came from the right of the Conservative Party. In their rhetoric, the empire, as in the 1880s, 90s rhetoric, the empire was not the source of British greatness, but a product of the unique greatness of the British nation. And you will see that there's a reason why I almost said Turkish. This is the type of nostalgia that we can find in the discourse of the leading Brexiteers in 2016. They argued that the same characteristics that had allowed Britain to build an empire could now produce something they called global Britain, which, it was implied, could repeat the successes of empire, but by modern means. Important Brexiteers like Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg positioned themselves as reviving the traditions of empire builders, risk-takers, adventurers that put their trust in the unique qualities of the British nation and, incidentally, also offered to lead it. They depicted Britain as an independent actor that had once colonized the world but would not be colonized by the EU, that is, by the European Union. Perhaps unsurprisingly, much of the Brexiteers' discourse on empire was therefore actually future-oriented, painting a picture of a bright future in which an unchained or released Britain could unleash its full technological and commercial potential. But this was still a discourse rooted in nostalgia for empire, because it was all about recovering its innate strength. And the re is important there. Recovering its innate strength, which had been allowed to become lost. The strength that had once allowed the British to become dominant in the world had been lost and needed to be recaptured. For some of the Brexiteers, the particular form of empire that could be created in the 21st century was not just global Britain in a general sense, it was more precise. It was something that they referred to as the Anglosphere, a community that included Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and in some cases also the United States, although there are differing opinions on that. An Anglosphere that would be based on unique Anglo-Saxon mentality and culture, and that could offer a more dynamic global alternative to the EU. Here, often the distinction was made between the bureaucratic traditions of the European continent on the one hand, and the entrepreneurial liberal traditions of the Anglosphere. It's important to note, though, that a simpler form of nostalgia for empire was also on display in the same period, and often from the same people who employed rhetoric on different levels in trying to attract voters for the Leave vote. That was a nostalgia that defended the empire in the face, for instance, of the Black Lives Matter protests and a renewed and critical interest in the legacy of slavery and colonialism. This kind of defensive nostalgia, in which the violence and racism of empire were presented as incidents in a larger story of Britain bringing progress through infrastructure, through education, and through the rule of law to the world, that was very visible in the popular press and appealed strongly to an older white constituency in Britain. So the nostalgia campaign worked on two levels at the same time. The Brexit referendum was a political event, but it is striking that at the time of the referendum, that's 2016, there seems to have been an upsurge in popular interest in the empire as well, embodied in the man who was arguably its last great exponent, Winston Churchill. In 2014, Boris Johnson, who would become the frontman of the official Leave campaign, published his biography of Churchill, called The Churchill Factor, a book of which many people at the time said, Boris wrote a book about himself and called it The Churchill Factor. In 2017, a year later, 2 films came out in Britain, one of them Darkest Hour and the other Dunkirk, which both focused on the period in early 1940 when the British Empire held out alone against Hitler, without help from the continent or America, under Churchill's leadership. In 2016, the first season of the series The Crown aired on Netflix, focusing on the last years of empire, 1947-1955, in which inevitably Churchill once more played a large role. Clearly, there was a demand, a created demand, or a genuine demand for this, which seems to suggest that Brexit could also be seen as the product of a deeper trend in British society in the years 2010-2015, something that went beyond politics. Now, let's look at the Turkish case. As I'm sure you all know, Turkey's commitment to EU membership is long-standing. It asked for association soon after the Rome Treaty, and received the status in 1963. And when you look at the text of the association agreement, the original agreement of 1963, you will see that full membership was the official aim right from the beginning. That never materialized, as we all know. A customs union was established in 1995, and Turkey was finally recognized as a candidate country in 1999. The actual accession process started in 2005, and as you also all know, it stalled a few years later and still remains stalled. Now, over the last 15 years, precisely the period of deteriorating relations with Europe, there has also been an upsurge of nostalgia for the Ottoman Empire in Turkey. As in the case of the UK, this has been well covered in the media internationally, primarily because the question was often asked, is Turkey aiming for the reconstitution of the Ottoman Empire in any form, in the Middle East or in the Balkans? But like in the case of the UK, most of that was very superficial. Now we also have solid academic research on the subject. I base myself primarily on 2 books. Hakan Yavuz's well-known 2020 book, Nostalgia for Empire, The Politics of Neo-Ottomanism, and Nagahan Tokdoğan's 2024 study, Neo-Ottomanism and the Politics of Emotions in Turkey, which actually offers a much deeper analysis of the phenomenon using the toolbox of psychology. Nostalgia for Empire, coupled to a rejection of the Kemalist Republic and its type of secularist modernization, has a long pedigree in Turkey, just like nostalgia for empire has a long pedigree in modern Britain. It started out in the 1940s with intellectuals like Necip Fazıl Kısakürek, Cemil Meriç, Yahya Kemal, Erol Güngör, and Samiha Ayverdi. These early neo-Ottomanists were all very different. Very different from each other. But it was Necip Fazıl who first used nostalgia for empire for political mobilization. In his Büyükdoğu, the Great East movement, rejecting Kemalists' imitation of the West as he saw it, and seeing Ottoman history and Islam as the twin authentic sources on which efforts to develop Turkey should be based. Now, Necip Fazıl was, of course, a Naqshbandi Sufi after his conversion by Sheikh al-Razi in 1934. And as Hakan Yavuz points out, all of the leading advocates of Neo-Ottomanism in the past 80 years have had close links to the Naqshbandi order, Turgut Özal, Necmettin Erbakan, and also Recep Tayyip Erdogan. This is linked to the extraordinary symbiosis achieved between the Ottoman state and the Helveti branch of the Naqshbandi order in the 19th century, when the Naqshbandis embraced the Ottoman Sultanate and Caliphate as the only viable defender of Sunni Muslim orthodoxy and independence in the face of European expansion, and when they worked throughout the empire to uphold both the state and the Sharia. Modern Naqshbandis display a particular nostalgia for this symbiosis of state and religion in the late Ottoman Empire. And you could say that, in a sense, the defensive reaction against the penetration of the West is in their DNA. The nostalgia for empire thus has been around for a long time, but it has undergone significant change. The 1953 celebration of the 5th centenary of the conquest of Constantinople, organized by the government of Menderes and Bayar, when Rumeli Hisari was restored. That may have been an early harbinger, but it was Turgut Özal in the 80s and early 90s who first consistently referred to the empire as something whose legacy had a lot to offer to contemporary Turkey. He saw the Ottoman model both as a basis for a solution to the ethnic and religious divisions in Turkey, which had been exacerbated, of course, by the 1980 military coup, and as a means to extend Turkey's influence in the region, particularly in the Balkans after the Cold War. In Özal's years, therefore, much more space was granted to public intellectuals with an Islamist agenda who also idealized the Ottoman Empire. People like Ali Bulac and İsmet Özel and Abdurrahman Dilipak, who held up the Ottoman Empire as an example, as an alternative. The journal Türkiye Günlüğü became the mouthpiece of this current and influential factor in the public debate. Where Özal combined his neo-Ottomanism with a strong admiration for the West, particularly, of course, the United States, that was very different for Necmettin Erbakan, the political leader of Turkey's Islamist political movement between 1970 and 2000. His Ottomanism had a much more strident anti-Western tone, similar to Necip Fazıl's. And for him and his following, their views were corroborated by the treatment of Muslims in the Balkans, in former Yugoslavia, during the Bosnian and Kosovo civil wars, which aroused great indignation in Turkey, where, after all, a significant part of the population has roots in the Balkans. Politically, Erbakan's Ottomanism served two purposes. Glorification of the Ottoman Empire resonated strongly with the mostly conservative migrants from Anatolia that by the 90s made up the majority of Turkey's big cities, and people who felt looked down upon by the secularist middle class and discriminated by the state. It was therefore a highly effective means for mobilization. Mobilization of Erbakan's core constituency. That was shown by the enthusiasm in these circles for celebrations with reenactments and public prayers in stadiums of the conquest of 1453 that took place after Erbakan's and young Erdogan's victory in the local elections of 1994 when they took over Istanbul. In subsequent years, those public celebrations were came very much to the fore, and they enthused the core constituency of what was then the Refah Partisi. The second purpose, aside from mobilization, as again Yavuz points out, that references to the Ottoman past could serve as a coded message, as a dog whistle. In a political environment in which calling for a greater role for Islam was still impossible. So referencing the Ottoman Empire served as a substitute. Many of Erbakan's statements of the 80s and 90s on the glories of the Ottoman past and his positive comments on the way justice and harmony reigned under the Ottomans can be read in that way. The nostalgia for empire of Erdogan essentially builds on that of Kısakürek and Erbakan, but with a twist. In the early years after the AKP takeover, so say 2002 to 2007, the nostalgia for empire was not so much in evidence. And the current president started to emphasize neo-Ottomanism more and more when after 2012, the boom years of the Turkish economy were over and relations with Europe soured and the internal opposition became more vocal. It was also linked to the increasing personality cult around the leader, the ace. The nostalgia of the earlier generations had always involved the creation of heroic figures to replace Mustafa Kemal Atatürk as an iconic figure, and notably Fatih Sultan Mehmet and Sultan Abdülhamid II. But now a direct link was made between them and Erdogan himself, who was portrayed as their direct successor, and that had never happened under Özal or Erbakan. Nostalgia for empire spread much more widely in these years, when in the 90s the celebrations around Fatih and his conquest of Constantinople and demonstrations for the resurrection of Hagia Sophia, that's to say turning it into a mosque again, had mobilized the Refah constituency. Popular publications and in particularly popular historical TV shows now popularized the appeal of nostalgia for empire much more widely, starting in the 2010s. Two of these productions stand out, and I'm sure you all know them. Diriliş Ertuğrul premiered in 2014 and ran for 5 years. And it showed the founder of the Ottoman dynasty as a Muslim Turkish national hero fighting Mongols, Crusaders, and Byzantines in the late 13th century. His work was ultimately to lay the basis for the Ottoman Principality. The other one, of course, is Payitaht, Abdülhamid, which ran from 2017 to 2021, and depicted the last really powerful Ottoman Sultan in a way that was strongly reminiscent of Necip Fazıl's portrayal of the same Sultan in his books as a pious and wise defender of an empire and of Islam against an aggressive West, in which the West, helped by westernized Ottomans, tries to undermine the empire and claim its territories. Necip Fazıl's virulent anti-Semitism is very present in the series too. All the main villains are Jews. Theodor Herzl, Alexander Helphand, Pavlus, Edmond Rothschild, Salman Levantin, they're all Jews, working for sinister European parties, notably the British. The Young Turks are long seen by Islamists as the precursors of the Kemalist Republic, are set down as traitors and are plotting against the Sultan as a crime against the nation. The Sultan himself is clearly Erdogan in disguise, in a manner that is very reminiscent of Johnson's Churchill. It's made very easy for the watching public to identify the similarities between the two Muslim Turkish heroes standing up for their country against the West in different eras, and doing so in a particular style, an authoritarian, sometimes aggressive style. The prejudices against Masons and Jews also reflect the long-standing views of Erdogan himself. But it did not work one way only. It was not only Erdogan who was being projected back into a fictionalized Abdul Hamid, the way Johnson was projected back into a fictionalized Winston Churchill. Erdogan himself also frequently started drawing parallels between what he saw as the humiliations of the Tanzimat reforms and the capitulations on the one hand, and current contemporary Western policies towards Turkey on the other. And the end result was a kind of circular reasoning, a historical account that modeled Sultan Abdul Hamid on Erdogan, strengthened the discourse in which Erdogan could present himself as an incarnation of this fictionalized predecessor. For the neo-Ottomanists led by Erdogan, Istanbul, Turkey's biggest city, but also the old imperial capital, of course, and the scene of Erbakan and Erdogan's early triumphs, became the prime object of the public expression of nostalgia for empire in the form of building projects in Ottomanesque style, the huge Çamlıca Mosque, the new mosque in Taksim, the interior of the AKM, and finally in 2020, by the realization of Necip Fazıl's old and most consistent demand, the reconversion of Hagia Sophia into a mosque by presidential decree. Nostalgia for empire also fed into Turkey's foreign policy. The international relations doctrine formulated by Ahmet Davutoğlu in his 2001 book, Stratejik Derinlik, which became the doctrine of Turkish policy from 2009 onwards, argued that Turkey needed a more active and independent foreign policy based in part on a shared Ottoman legacy of the countries in the region. And that way, he argued, in a manner that's very reminiscent of the discourse of the Brexiteers a few years later, Turkey's unrealized potential could be unleashed. A similar kind of reasoning. Now, what can we learn, having so briefly summarized the history of nostalgia for empire in these two countries? What can we say about possible similarities? There are, I think, several. We have seen that in both cases, the nostalgia is not recent, but in fact, quite an old movement that has been around for most of the 20th century, which has been reinterpreted by later generations of politicians in a way that has evolved over time. In the discourse of the politicians, the empire is glorified, both the British Empire and the Ottoman Empire, but it's also reinterpreted as a product of the exceptional character of the nation. So the nation of Ertuğrul creates the empire. It's the nation of Drake that creates the British Empire. The empires are proof of greatness of a nation. And this is the fundamental sort of and very problematic reasoning. There is a nostalgia for empire, but it is a nationalist nostalgia for empire. And that is, of course, a huge historical fallacy, because empires are anything but national. But it makes possible the use of nostalgia for a nationalist program. The empire is set down as a counterexample to the humiliation and passivity that the nation has experienced. In the British case, in the years of its membership of the European Union. In the Turkish case, in the years it was dominated by the Kemalists. The interests of the nation have been subjugated to those of foreigners. But the empire shows that this does not have to be the case, and indeed has not always been the case. On the face of it, the references to the empires are about the past. But in reality, they revolve around the idea that the empires are examples of how the nation can recover its strength and glory now and in the future. Essentially, the nostalgia for empire is about discovering a recipe for future greatness. In each case, the population's attention is captured not only through political slogans and activities, but certainly also through the employment of popular culture, written on the screen, large and small, and of course increasingly on the internet. In both cases, the nationalist nostalgia for empire has been instrumentalized in the tensions with the EU. That nostalgia has basically been used to say the EU is not needed and indeed can be damaging. Now, of course, you can make two quite fundamental objections to highlighting the role of nostalgia for empire in the process of alienation between the European Union on the one hand and Turkey and the United Kingdom on the other. And these are absolutely correct. The first, quite reasonable objection is that within the EU there are also former empires. A continental one in the shape of the former Habsburg Empire, and a colonial one in the shape of the French Empire. So why then has nostalgia for empire not become a political force that could be mobilized against the EU in countries like France or Austria or Hungary? That's the first question you can ask, the first objection. The second is whether there are no other reasons for the break in relations that were far more important than nostalgia for empire. Let's take them in turn. Why does nostalgia for empire play almost no role within the EU? In the case of France, this is explained, I think, by the sheer force of two historical traumas. The first one is the one it shares with the other founder members of the EU. That's to say, the barbarism of Nazi conquest and occupation, with all the material and psychological destruction that the war brought with it. The massacre at Oradour-sur-Glane is a sample of the first, and the obliteration of cities like Le Havre and Cherbourg through Allied bombing is an example of the material devastation. This means that the idea of European integration as a political project made obvious sense in the France of the post-war era. The other trauma is specific to France. The dismantling of the colonial empires after World War II was a bloody process. All colonial powers fought to retain their overseas possessions in the face of emancipatory national movements. The British in Kenya and Malaysia, the Dutch in Indonesia, the French in Indochina, the Portuguese in Angola, and the Belgians in the Congo. But the French had Algeria too, and Algeria was a special case. It was not a colony, it was a province of France, intimately linked to metropolitan France, with a white settler population of more than 1 million. The Algerian War, the decolonization war in Algeria, lasted for 8 years, costed up to 1.5 million lives, and led to the migration of 900,000 white settlers for France. So there's an enormous trauma there too, which affects the way empire is judged. White nostalgia for Algeria was and is strong among the refugees and their families themselves. And it was a factor in the growth of the far-right movement in France from the 60s onwards. But it was never a force in France as a whole. The Evian Accords, concluded by de Gaulle, that recognized Algerian independence, were supported by over 90% of the French population in a referendum, an official referendum. For the French, the memory of an exceedingly brutal and bloody and lost war on its doorstep has completely overshadowed the memory of empire. While the nostalgia, for the former dominant nations of the Habsburg Empire, that's to say Austria and Hungary, the situation is different. Immediately after the dissolution of the empire in 1918, the citizens of Austria opted not for the restoration of empire, but to become members of the German Republic. They wanted inclusion into Germany, something which was blocked by the victorious Entente powers. The unification with Germany was achieved 20 years later, of course, by the Nazi regime, and contrary to the impression you may have gained from The Sound of Music, it was widely supported in Austria. It was very popular. The resulting ambiguous position as victim and helper of Nazism led first to Austria's occupation for 10 years after the war, and then to its neutral status. It only became a member of the European Union in 1995 as part of the enlargement to the east. In this precarious situation, nostalgia for empire did emerge, but as a popular form of escapism rather than as something that might relate to the contemporary condition of the country or its future. Its most prominent exponent, which you all know, undoubtedly is the trilogy of Sissi films, 1955-57, starring Romy Schneider. But there are other elements as well. The yearly New Year's concert in Vienna, popular on television. It's actually a Nazi invention during World War II. But since 1958, it always ends with Strauss's An der schöne blaue Donau and the Radetzky March, pieces with a strong nostalgic reference to the Habsburg Empire. But like Sissi, it is a romantic escapism rather than an instrument for political mobilization. In this sense, nostalgia for empire in Austria is a non-issue. The same is true for Hungary. After the end of the Cold War, and particularly under Viktor Orban's first premiership in 1998, there was a revival of irredentist nationalism focused on the large Hungarian communities that have been cut off from Hungary under the Treaty of Trianon in 1920, and are now living in neighboring countries like Serbia, Romania, Slovakia, Ukraine. But this was an ethnic nationalist movement, and still is, without reference to the multinational Habsburg past. Much more akin to the ideological orientation of Admiral Horthy, who ruled Hungary between 1919 and 1944, and who is now a national hero again under Orban's government. So the nostalgia was one for a Hungarian nation and never for the empire. For different reasons, therefore, we can say that unlike in the case of Turkey and the United Kingdom, nostalgia for empire is not a source of political mobilization within the EU. In the countries of Western Europe, nostalgia for the colonial empires is a niche interest of white people with roots in the colonies, while in Central Europe, the Habsburg past is either a commodified form of romantic escapism or irrelevant, as diametrically opposed to the irredentist ethnic nationalism in Hungary. Reactionary movements trying to restore the German Empire, such as the Reichsbürger, are tiny fractions on the political fringe. And as to the second question, you have not asked, but probably thought of, yes, the culture of nostalgia for empire was an instrument, and quite a powerful one, for those who wanted to break with the EU, rather than a root cause of the breakdown. Both in the halting of Turkey's accession process and in Brexit, there were a number of other and perhaps more important factors at work as well. The financial crisis of 2008 to 2012 played an important role. In the United Kingdom, it led to years of financial austerity by the Conservative government of Cameron, which caused enormous economic hardship for the less well-off. This coincided with an unprecedented growth of labor migration into Britain, for which the EU was blamed. In Europe, some of the same factors were at work and lowered support for Turkey's accession. While in Turkey, which largely escaped the crisis of 2008 because it had transformed its financial system after the deep crisis of 1999-2000, the appetite for joining also diminished, or at least was lowered. The crisis also strengthened the xenophobic and particularly Islamophobic populist right in Europe, which made center-right parties adopt many of the positions of the far right. At the same time, that's to say in the years 2000 to 2012, say 2008 to 2012, the increasingly authoritarian, oppressive, and anti-Western policies of the Turkish government also opened up a gulf with Europe. So, to repeat, both Brexit and the Turkish-European separation had a number of underlying causes unrelated to nostalgia for empire. But still, that nostalgia played a crucial role. Now, let me try to summarize why I think that is. There's nothing wrong with nostalgia. Nostalgia is characteristic of the human mind. It binds us to our past, and it gives us a sense of belonging. It can even be a very pleasant experience, and it has produced great works of art. The problem arises when nostalgia is mobilized politically and focused on a historical reality that has not been lived by the vast majority of the public, and which has been manipulated to serve the purpose of contemporary political movements. The British Empire of the century between 1850 and 1950 was not a benign cultural family of nations created by quintessentially British pioneers and united by free trade and the rule of law. It was a huge achievement, but like the other colonial empires, one built on violence, exploitation, and racism. The Ottoman Empire, a completely different animal, was a complex, multi-ethnic, multi-religious political structure that had evolved over centuries, not a state built on Turkish and Islamic nationalism. Before 1912, Turks were no more a majority in the Ottoman Empire than Englishmen in the British. We know next to nothing about the historical Ertuğrul, but Sultan Abdul Hamid has been extensively studied, and he bears no resemblance to the thinly disguised Erdogan that is the Sultan in the series Payitaht, and he never slapped anyone. The reason this kind of nostalgia, built on historical fallacies and engineered for contemporary political purpose, is a poison is that it suggests to the people exposed to it that there are seductive alternative realities to the one that are actually relevant and that can form the basis for rational policies. These relevant and rational policies in the case of Great Britain and Turkey would have meant closer integration with Europe in the shape of the European Union, economically and politically. The mechanism for nostalgia politics in both cases is that it manipulated and sanitized, partly also invented, versions of the imperial past and then sold these as a pattern for a glorious future. And that glorious future is a national one, not one of European integration. The process of indoctrination is circular. Boris Johnson writes a biography of Winston Churchill in which the hero is modeled on himself, and then he campaigns on the basis that he is going to be the new Churchill, saving the nation in its hour of difficulty. Tayyip Erdogan does the same, publicly supporting the depiction of Sultan Abdulhamid, modeled on himself, and then claiming to be the true successor to that model. The current international crisis exposes the very real damage that has been caused when the path of further European integration was abandoned. For Britain and Turkey, integration would have meant higher economic growth, more political influence, and better environmental and democratic safeguards, while for the EU, it would have produced a much stronger position on the world stage in terms of demographics, economy, and security. The popularization of imperial nostalgia deprives people of the opportunity to weigh realistic alternatives in the here and now by indoctrinating them with an imperialist utopia for the nation. That is its poisonous quality. One final note. The lecture has been about nostalgia for empire. It will not have escaped you. But we should not forget that nostalgia for empire is not the only form of nostalgia that has been manipulated and exploited politically over the last 2 decades. All over Europe, right-wing populists have gained support in most countries, now amounting to roughly 25% of the electorate, by exploiting and creating a nostalgia for a Europe of nation states as it was in the 1950s, or supposed to have been in the 1950s. An almost wholly white Christian utopia with safety, social cohesion, low immigration, solid blue-collar jobs, and a clear and uncomplicated division of gender roles. A nation led by white men. They have attracted voters with a vision for the future based on nostalgia for a past that never was. A vision that is unrealistic and, above all, irrelevant to the future of Europe. So that is a very different phenomenon, but like the nostalgia for empire, it is proving to be a dangerous poison for our societies as well. Thank you.